So now let's look at how we can start cleaning up this demo by introducing data binding. First, we're going to go in here to the XAML of our window and start pulling values into the XAML instead of pushing things from the code behind. So first we'll go to our customer ID label here, and we'll introduce a binding for the content property that says go and get me the ID property of whatever my data context is. So whenever you see a binding that just has one thing next to it, that one thing next to it is the path or the property name on the data context object that flows down to this. And we talked about data context in the slides, and we'll see that we're going to set it from the code behind in a moment. But data context is an overall ambient data object that flows down the visual tree and is accessible for data binding on elements. So this implies that for this label at least, there has to be a data context object that has an ID property on it, and the binding is going to grab that value and put it into the content property for us. Likewise, we can go down to our text box here and put text binding last name. So it's the text property we want to set, that's the target. On the source object, we're expecting there to be a last name property, and that source object has to be set as the data context for this text box. Next, for our list box, we can drop down here and we could do a binding like this. Ultimately, we need to get a collection into our item source property, and we can just use binding here. And that basically says I'm expecting the data context for this list box to be a collection of something I'm going to present. And by default, it will call toString on each one of those objects if we don't do anything else here. So if you remember from the previous run, we're expecting a list of order dates here. We can put a list of order dates and it will call toString on each of those, and we'll see the date rendered as text. But binding on its own like this implies that the source object is the data context and that we're not looking for any particular property on that data context. We're expecting it to be whole objects that we're pushing in as a collection here. Then we could drop down to the data grid and do the same thing. Now this implies that this data grid's data context has to be set to whatever collection it expects to render out, which in our case happens to be order items. Now if you're experienced with data binding, this may look a little weird because this implies that we have a different data context for the data grid, for the list box, and for the customer-oriented controls up above, which is not something you'd normally do, and we'll evolve past that quickly here in the demos. So now let's drop into the code behind, and what we could do is go in here after we've retrieved our first customer. We could switch things here to set the overall data context for the window itself to that customer object. That means it's going to be set at the root level on the window, and it's going to flow down the visual tree to all the elements within the window, and that will be their available data context unless it is set to something different at an element level. For our order list, we could replace setting the item source directly with setting a data context for that list, because the item source is being set through the binding now that we added in the XAML. And then down here in our order selected handler, we could do the same where we replace setting the item source on the data grid with setting a data context that flows into it. And then the binding on the item source property in the XAML will pick it up and render it. The other thing we probably want to do is get rid of the ugly columns that we didn't intend to render in the first place. So I'm going to drop down here to the data grid and say auto-generate columns false, and add in some column definitions that include just those columns that we want to do. Now the other thing to point out here in the XAML is the way data contexts work in list-bound controls. So we've got the data grid as a whole is being set to whatever the current data context is on that element, which we just programmatically set in the code behind to be an order items collection. However, notice these bindings are assuming their data context has properties like ID, instructions, product ID, and so on. That's because when a list-oriented control like a data grid, list box, or combo box renders out its items, it sets the data context for the item being rendered to be the individual item. So in the case of a data grid, it's rendering out a whole row with these columns in it. It sets the data context for that row object to be the individual item in the collection that it's rendering. So each of these, the data context is just a single order item. And therefore their binding path can be equal to just the property names on that object. The other thing to point out in review here is that when you see binding ID here, this is 100% equivalent to writing it this way. When you say binding ID, you're really implicitly setting the path through a parameterized constructor on the binding object. So binding instructions here really means set the path equal to instructions. And we'll get to other properties that the binding has in later modules. So with that code in place, I can go ahead and run. And we can see our data is populated like before, and our selections happen, and now we don't have the extra columns that we didn't want in the first place. So if we drop into the code behind here, we can clean up those commented lines of code. The other thing to point out here is that in the onSave method, we don't have to do all this work to pull individual values from controls and put them into properties on an object, because the object we set as the data context is being tracked in our case by Entity Framework, and it knows about those properties changed because the whole object was set as the data context. And when we're changing those properties, Entity Framework is raising property change notifications and it knows about those. So we can simply go off and save changes here and not have to do any pushing and pulling anymore. So I can go ahead and run. I can modify Puckett's name, save, shut down, and restart. And we can see those changes were persisted. Now for just one editable field here, it doesn't really pay huge dividends to be data binding, but where it starts to become really apparent is when you have a big data entry form with lots of fields. So let's go up here and add a few more rows to our grid, and we'll add a few more data entry forms for other properties on a customer. So now we're binding to the customer last name, first name, phone, and email in individual text boxes, and we don't have to make any modifications to the code behind now, because the code behind is just pushing a whole customer object into the data context, and it will flow down to all of these bindings. So now we could run. We could modify first name, last name, customer phone, save our changes, shut down and restart. And all those changes have been persisted. So now you just get to focus on the markup and deciding how do you want to render something and what is the property on the data context that's going to give you that data.